What if the most terrifying weapon ever aimed at a human being wasn't a blade or a bullet, but a mother's love turned against her? That is exactly what happened to Maria Antonia, one woman in Paris in the summer of 1793. And what they did to her in 76 days makes the guillotine look like an act of mercy. This is the story they don't fully tell you. The story of how a revolution, drunk on its own power, decided that killing a woman wasn't enough. They wanted to destroy her first. Her name was Marie Antoinette, and she was prisoner number 280. Where we go where the history books don't dare. Hit subscribe before we begin, because you won't want to miss what comes next. Before the dungeon, before the tribunal, before the blade, you need to understand who she actually was. Because the woman who walked to her death on October 16, 1793, bore almost no resemblance to the monster France had convinced itself she was. She was born Maria Antonia in Vienna on November 2nd, 1755, youngest daughter of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. At 14 years old, she was handed across a border like a diplomatic package and married to the future Louis XVI of France. Not for love, for politics. Austria and France needed each other. She was the price of that deal. From her very first day at Versailles, the French court treated her like an outsider. She was Austrian, enemy blood. She was young, uncertain, and awkward in French customs. The courtiers whispered behind her back. They mocked her accent. They catalogued her every mistake, and her own husband ignored her for 7 long years before their marriage was even consummated. A humiliation so complete it became gossip across the entire continent. So she escaped the only way she knew how: lavish gowns, elaborate hairstyles, late nights at her private retreat, the Petit Trianon. When the people of France were starving in the streets, they looked at Versailles and saw excess. They gave her a name for it: Madame Deficit. Did she ever say, "Let them eat cake"? No. That line was invented propaganda, but it didn't matter. She had already become the perfect scapegoat. Foreign, female, and royal, 3 things that made her impossible to defend when the revolution finally arrived in 1789. Here is what the revolutionary posters never showed you. By 1793, Marie Antoinette was not that girl anymore. She was a 37-year-old mother who had already buried her eldest son, a 7-year-old boy taken by tuberculosis. She had watched her husband, Louis XVI, led to the guillotine on January 21, 1793. She had spent months locked inside the Temple prison in Paris with her 2 surviving children, knowing every sunrise might be their last. She had already lost her crown, her country, her husband, and her freedom. The revolutionaries were about to show her that she still had something left to lose. The Temple prison was a medieval fortress, cold stone, permanent shadow, built by the Knights Templar centuries before. It didn't need to try to feel like a place of suffering. It simply was one. After Louis XVI's execution, Marie Antoinette was confined there with her 14-year-old daughter Marie Therese and her 8-year-old son Louis Charles. She tried to hold some thread of normal life together for them. Lessons in the morning, prayers at night, her body between her children, and the darkness pressing in from every direction. But the guards were always watching, and they were reporting everything back to the Committee of Public Safety, the revolutionary government that now held absolute power over France and everyone in it. What those guards noticed was simple: Marie Antoinette could endure almost anything. Hunger, humiliation, isolation. She could take it, but threaten her children, and she came undone. So they began running experiments in cruelty. They restricted her access to her children, forcing her to beg guards for permission to see her own son and daughter. They stationed additional men inside their quarters, men who sat in silence and watched. Every private moment, every whispered conversation, every tear recorded and reported to the state. The children were forbidden from speaking German, their mother's native language, meaning even their most intimate family moments were filtered through a foreign tongue under surveillance. Under this pressure, Marie Antoinette began to fracture. Her hair, once a warm light brown, turned completely white. Medical historians today recognize the phenomenon. It even carries a name, Marie Antoinette syndrome, a real physiological response to catastrophic stress. She stopped eating. She developed severe hemorrhaging. She desperately tried to hide, but she held on. She still had her children. The Committee of Public Safety decided that had to end. July 3rd, 1793. 10 o'clock at night. Marie Antoinette had just tucked 8-year-old Louis Charles into bed. He was asleep beside her, as he had been every night since they took his father away. She hadn't let him out of her reach in 6 months. Then the boots. Multiple men climbing the tower stairs. Heavy, deliberate, getting louder. The door crashed open. 6 municipal guards, one holding an official decree from the Committee of Public Safety. The order was absolute. Louis Charles was to be removed from his mother's custody and placed under the care of the Republic for education. His mother's influence was deemed corrupting. He would be raised to forget who she was. What happened in the next 60 minutes is documented in the memoir of Marie Théarcy, the daughter who survived to write it down. The former Queen of France threw herself between the guards and her sleeping child. She grabbed Louis Charles and pulled him against her chest so hard he woke up crying, and then she screamed. Not in the polished, measured tones of royalty, raw, animal, the sound of a mother whose last thing is being taken from her. You will not have him. Kill me first. He is a child. The guards presented the decree. It changed nothing. They threatened violence. It changed nothing. For 1 full hour, 60 uninterrupted minutes, she barricaded the doorway with her own body, holding her sobbing son, refusing to move. The guards grew aggressive. Marie Théarcy was hysterical. Louis Charles was terrified and weeping. Finally, Madame Elizabeth, Marie Antoinette's sister-in-law, begged her to stop before someone was harmed. The resistance broke. She pressed her lips to her son's forehead. She whispered something in his ear. Whatever she said in those final seconds, no one recorded it. No one ever will. And then she stood back and watched 6 grown men drag her 8-year-old boy down the stone staircase until the sound of his crying faded into silence. She collapsed and did not move for hours. What happened to Louis Charles next is one of the darkest footnotes in the entire French Revolution. He was placed in the care of a man named Antoine Simon, a radical cobbler chosen specifically to demolish the boy's identity. Simon locked him in a dark, windowless room. He was forced to wear a red revolutionary cap and made to sing songs mocking the monarchy. He was taught to curse his own mother, to call her names, to repeat accusations of treason and conspiracy against France. When he refused, Simon beat him, starved him, kept him in isolation until the child's spirit shattered. Within weeks, Louis Charles was saying whatever they told him to say, including accusations so deliberately monstrous that they would be deployed as a weapon against his mother in the most devastating moment of her trial. Marie Antoinette didn't know the details. She only knew that her son was somewhere suffering in the dark, and there was nothing on earth she could do about it. On August 1st, 1793, guards came for her at 2 in the morning. No warning, no explanation. She was transferred. She begged to say goodbye to her daughter and Madame Elizabeth. They refused. She was taken downstairs in the dark, pushed into a carriage, and driven through the sleeping streets of Paris to a place called the Conciergerie. If you know anything about the French Revolution, that name stops you cold. The Conciergerie was known as the antechamber of the guillotine. Prisoners went there to wait the short distance between verdict and blade. Marie Antoinette wasn't simply being relocated. She was being prepared for death. But the revolutionaries wanted those final weeks to be as psychologically devastating as possible. She became prisoner number 280. Not the former Queen of France, not even her name. A number. Her cell measured roughly 12 feet by 8. Damp stone walls, a thin straw mattress, a wooden table, 2 chairs, 1 candle, no window. Just the suffocating weight of medieval stone pressing in from every direction. They gave her a folding privacy screen, a small barrier so she could change clothes or use the chamber pot without being exposed. It sounds almost considerate. It was theatre, because inside that cell, at every hour of every day and night, sat 2 armed guards. They watched her eat. They watched her sleep. They watched her change her clothes behind that pointless screen. They watched her pray. They watched her cry. This wasn't security. Marie Antoinette was a sick, middle-aged woman in a locked dungeon. This was surveillance designed to annihilate her last shred of private selfhood. Historical accounts describe how she responded. She would sit motionless for hours, face completely blank, staring at the wall. She barely spoke, barely moved, barely ate. But at night, when the candle burned low and she thought the darkness might give her cover, the guards heard her, whispering the same name over and over. Louis Charles, Louis Charles, Louis Charles. Her bleeding worsened. She hemorrhaged through her clothing and had to ask her guards, those same staring, silent, merciless guards, for rags. She endured it without complaint. Her hair fell out in fistfuls. She was 37 years old. She looked 60. October 14, 1793, 8 in the morning. Marie Antoinette was brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal. The courtroom was packed. Officials, journalists, and citizens who had come to watch a queen be buried publicly before the blade made it permanent. The verdict had already been written. The trial was a performance. The prosecutor, Antoine Tinville, came armed with charges of treason, conspiracy, financial crimes against France, and collusion with foreign enemies. For 2 days, Marie Antoinette sat pale and hollow in the defendant's chair, dressed in widow's black, and answered every accusation with a composure that visibly unsettled the room. She refuted lies calmly. She admitted genuine faults without groveling. She refused to dissolve into the broken, weeping spectacle they were hoping to stage for the crowd. So Tinville reached for the darkest weapon available to him. He called the journalist Jacques H.A. Burt to the stand, and H.A. Burt repeated accusations that had been extracted from 8-year-old Louis Charles, accusations that his mother had committed incest against him. The courtroom went silent. Even the mob that had gathered to jeer fell quiet. There are things so cruel that they briefly stun even the desensitized. This was one of them. Marie Antoinette had withstood everything. The slander, the isolation, the loss of her son, the loss of her husband, the dungeons, the surveillance, the humiliation. She had not broken. But this weaponization of her child's voice against her, this most intimate and grotesque violation, this cracked something open. She rose from her chair. Her voice, steady through every previous hour of the trial, shook now. Not with fear. With something older and fiercer than fear. Nature itself refuses to respond to such a charge laid against a mother, she said. And then she turned away from the judges. She looked directly at the women in the crowd. The mothers, the daughters, the sisters who had come to watch her die. I appeal to every mother present in this room. The courtroom erupted. Women in the crowd who had arrived full of revolutionary fury were openly weeping. Even some officials looked away. It was too much. It had gone too far. It didn't matter. Fouquier Tinville had what he needed. At 4 in the morning on October 16, 1793, after a trial spanning less than 2 days and built on manufactured evidence, Marie Antoinette was found guilty of high treason and crimes against the state. Sentence: death by guillotine, scheduled for that same morning. They gave her a few hours in her cell. She asked for pen and paper, and for once, they gave it to her. She didn't write a political document. She didn't curse the men who had destroyed her. She wrote to Madame Elizabeth, her sister-in-law, still imprisoned in the Temple with Marie Therese. She wrote that she had just been condemned, not to a shameful death, which was reserved for criminals, but to rejoin her husband, whom she hoped to meet as innocent as he had been. She wrote that she was calm, because her conscience carried nothing to reproach her with. She begged Madame Elizabeth to care for her children. She asked her son never to seek revenge for their deaths. She forgave her enemies. She asked pardon for any harm she had caused. 4 pages. Signed simply Marie Antoinette. Then she handed it to a guard, and it disappeared forever. The letter was intercepted. It went into a revolutionary archive and was not found for decades. Long after every person she had addressed it to was dead, Madame Elizabeth went to the guillotine the following year. Marie Therese survived, but never received the letter. Her mother's last words never reached anyone they were meant for. At 11 in the morning, the executioner's assistant entered her cell. First, they took her dress, the simple black mourning gown she had worn since Louis XV's death. She was given a plain white chemise, the standard garment of the condemned. She asked to change in private, refused. Then her hair. The white, brittle strands were hacked off with shears. No ceremony. Just rough hands and a blade. Then her hands were bound behind her back with coarse rope, pulled tight enough to cut into her wrists. She said quietly, almost to herself, "You did not bind my husband's hands like this." The guard said nothing. She was led out of the conciergerie into daylight for the first time in 76 days. The brightness hurt her eyes. She had expected a closed carriage, the small courtesy they had extended to Louis XVI. Instead, there was a wooden tumbrel, an open cart used for hauling animal carcasses, and a plank for her to sit on with her hands tied, and her white hair shorn, and her face open to all of Paris. The journey to the Place de la Révolution took over an hour. Tens of thousands of people lined the streets. They screamed at her, they threw things. At a window above the wrote the revolutionary artist Jacques. Louis David sat sketching furiously. His drawing survives. It shows a thin woman sitting perfectly upright on a plank in an open cart, her face rigid with something that isn't quite dignity and isn't quite defeat. It's something harder than either. At 12:15 p.m., the cart stopped. She climbed the scaffold steps without help. Her legs trembled. Her head did not lower. And then, in the last second of her life, she stepped on the executioner's foot. She stopped. She turned to face him. She spoke her final words. "Pardon me, sir. I did not mean to do it." An apology to the man about to kill her. Not theatrical, not ironic, just the deep reflex of a life shaped by protocol and, beneath it, something that no 76-day campaign of calculated cruelty had managed to extinguish. Grace. The blade fell at 12:15 p.m. on October 16, 1793. The French Revolution set out to destroy Marie Antoinette completely, not just her body, but her spirit, her identity, her memory. They took her son. They took her privacy. They weaponized her child against her in open court. They stripped her name and gave her a number. They cut her hair and bound her hands and paraded her through a city screaming for her blood. And in the end, they failed. Because in designing the perfect destruction of a queen, they revealed something they never intended to show anyone: the human being she actually was, a mother who fought with every cell in her body for her children, a woman who answered monstrous accusations with words that made a bloodthirsty courtroom go silent. A prisoner who, stepping onto the scaffold, found it more important to apologize than to hate. They wanted history to remember Widow Capet, a traitor, a symbol, a cautionary tale about the price of excess. Instead, history remembers a woman who spent 76 days being methodically broken, walked up the steps of a guillotine at the end of it, and still had enough left inside her to say "pardon me." That was the one thing they could not take. And they never did.